Welcome to the Media Freedom Rapid Responses webinar on the Monitoring Report 2024. Today's webinar will have the following structure. We will first discuss an overview of the Monitoring Report 2024 with a focus on country chapters from Georgia, Italy, Ukraine, and France. Next, we will proceed to special chapters presented in the report based on emerging trends. In this section, we will be highlighting the election-related violations, followed by spoofing and doppelganger attacks, and finally, violations related to the environmental reporting. Please note your questions in the chat so that our speakers can answer them at the end of the webinar. I am Gürkan Özturan, Media Freedom Monitoring Officer at the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, and today I will be moderating the webinar. Our speakers are my colleague Kara Reker, monitoring officers also from the ECPMF, Teona Sekniashvili, Europe Network and Advocacy Officer from International Press Institute, Ronja Koskinen, Press Freedom Officer, also from IPI, and Karol Lutka, Eastern Europe Advocacy Officer, again from IPI. And finally, Camille Magnisalis, Press Freedom Monitoring and Communications Officer at the European Federation of Journalists. Kara, I would like to start with you first. Can you give us an overview of the report? What are the outstanding developments of 2024 in the field of media freedom in Europe?
Yes, absolutely. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm being told I'm having network issues, but thank you so much for having me and organizing the webinar. I'm just going to very briefly scratch the surface of the very general findings, and my colleagues will go into detail on specific countries and specific themes. But just to give you an overview, the Mapping Media Project in general monitors 35 European countries. This includes all EU countries and all candidate countries. This monitoring report for 2024 has zoomed in on 6 EU countries and 6 candidate countries, the EU countries being Belgium, France, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, and the Netherlands, and the candidate countries being Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Serbia, Turkey, and Ukraine. And the 3 themes, as mentioned by Gürkan, were the reporting related to elections, to the environment and climate, and spoofing. In total, for all these 35 countries, for 2024, we've monitored 1,548 incidents of press freedom violations, which affected 2,569 media-related persons or entities. This also means that we have documented an increase in press freedom violation for last year compared to 2023, where it was 1,113 violations. In terms of attacks, so which kind of attacks do we see the most? Just in general, we group all attacks that we monitor in 5 different broader categories. That's verbal attacks, censorship, physical attacks, legal attacks, and attacks on property. And for 2024, we saw that verbal attacks were the most prominent. So that means intimidation, harassment, including also death threats and smear campaigns. This has been a trend for several years. Followed by censorship, we've seen an increase there, meaning especially blocked journalistic activities, so blocked access to events, blocked access to information, but in certain incidents that also includes sort of disruption and distribution of journalistic content and editorial interference. While these are the most common types of attacks, of course, they don't necessarily measure severity. So we've also documented 266 physical attacks, and 40% of those result in injury. Just to keep this in mind, sort of. In terms of context, so where do most of these attacks take place? Online attacks are the most prominent, have been the most prominent for 2024. This includes online hate, smear campaigns, also death threats. And that's especially worrying because it's quite hard to track the sources of online attacks. So the sort of risk of impunity is quite high. And then this is followed by demonstrations. For journalists, these are quite a dangerous workplace. Usually here the attackers are private individuals. And then thirdly, we've also seen a rise here. This is attacks at court. So in cases where journalists are sentenced at court, but this also includes court decisions blocking access to article or information, also incidences of slaps. And lastly, so who do we see commits most of these press freedom violations. Private individuals are the most prominent group. They commit about 30% of all the attacks, mostly verbal attacks against journalists and media workers. Then secondly, and again, we've seen an increase here, attacks committed by legislation, so meaning politicians and public officials. So these are persons in position of power that really sort of use their power and their influence to attack journalists verbally. This includes also public smear campaigns, online at press conferences, on TV, etc. And we've seen a rise here, which is really quite concerning. And then the third group of perpetrators is just unknown. So again, especially online, where we a lot of times just can't really track where the press freedom violations comes from. Yeah, I will wrap it up here, leave it to my colleagues. For more information on the general data and the findings, please consult the monitoring report or just drop your questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara. And we will now be proceeding with the country chapters, and our first country in focus will be Georgia. We have started monitoring Georgia in the year 2024 after it was announced as a candidate country at the end of 2023. And very rapidly, actually, Georgia has assumed a major role in MFRR's monitoring activities. Teona, would you please update us on what has been the most significant developments in Georgia in 2024?
Thank you very much, Gurkan. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, sure. But before I do this, I want to say that while we are speaking here, the Batumi City Court in Georgia is hearing the case of Mzia Maglobeli, who is an imprisoned journalist in Georgia. She's the founder and the director of Net Gazeti and Batumi Lebi, two of the most prominent independent media outlets, and she is a valued member of the IPI Global Network. We will see how this hearing will end, and we will see whether she will be released today or not. She faces up to 7 years jail time. And meanwhile, my organization, International Press Institute, has launched a campaign advocating for Mzia's release. And if you have not signed our call, you can do so. And I'm sharing the link in the webinar chat. Yes, as you said, Gurkan, Georgia did really assume a really important and large role in our monitoring activities, which is not necessarily a good thing, I would say, because yes, the press freedom deteriorated really at an alarming rate in Georgia in 2024, and this was happening amid a broader deterioration of democratic freedoms and democracy in general. So in 2024, we have documented 138 cases of media freedom violations, which involved 241 persons or entities related to media. It is noteworthy that more than the third of the cases, 37% of those cases were perpetrated, of these attacks were on journalists, were perpetrated by the police or state security forces. But nobody, according to our monitoring and according to what we are hearing from the journalists on the ground, nobody from these forces have been held accountable. So I would say that impunity for crimes against journalists is the most pressing issue in Georgia right now. As you may all know, Georgia adopted the Foreign Agents Law entitled Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence in 2024. First, this law was introduced in the spring of 2023, but was eventually withdrawn as a result of widespread international criticism and widespread protests in the streets of Tbilisi and also other cities in Georgia. But then the Georgian government reintroduced the law and eventually also overrode the presidential veto, and the law was adopted. This was not the only law threatening press freedom and the very existence of independent journalism and civil society in Georgia. The Georgian parliament has also adopted the law on so-called anti-LGBT propaganda law, which basically prevents broadcasters from reporting on the issues that the queer community in Georgia faces. The press freedom deterioration was also became quite, abundantly evident during the elections in Georgia, during the parliamentary elections, which was really very crucial for Georgia. We have recorded 83 election-related violations on media freedom, which included 41 media workers. 29 of this were physical attacks on journalists and camera operators, but there were also many cases, namely 24 cases of verbal assaults and intimidations on journalists. And meanwhile, it goes without saying that smear campaigns continued unabated in Georgia, and journalists have been very often referred to spies and agents or enemies, which is also quite problematic as it further erodes trust in independent journalism. And one last thing that I'll mention, and I promise I'll wrap it up. During the elections, but also before elections, the foreign journalists were often barred from entering Georgia, and there were cases of Czech, Armenian, Belarusian journalists who have been barred from entering Georgia simply, and this was a really arbitrary decision, and they have not been really explained what was the rationale behind this travel ban. That also remains a significant problem. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Teona. And our next country of focus will be Italy, where again we have recorded a significant number of alerts from the year 2024. Ronja, could you please update us on what the situation has been like in Italy in 2024?
Thank you, Gurkan. Yes, press freedom situation has definitely deteriorated in the past year under the right-wing government of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and her party, Brothers of Italy. We saw a lot of verbal attacks, censorship, legal actions against journalists and media outlets. And we also did an MFRR mission to Italy, which pretty much highlighted the same issues that I'm going to go through in the next few minutes. One of the prominent cases for sure was concerns about the editorial independence of public broadcaster RAI. There were both like internal calls and criticism, and also from the outside that the public broadcaster became a sort of government mouthpiece. Some of the noteworthy censorship incidents included the cancellation of Antonio Scurati's anti-fascist monologue, and also Serena Bortome, host of the program where this monologue was supposed to be broadcasted, faced disciplinary action from RAI management when she, commented on this case publicly. Also, the leading news agency AGI, there were, talks that it would be sold to a prominent Lega politician. And this, of course, raised concerns about political interference. And in a very short period of time, several editors-in-chief were dismissed in different newspapers. And I think all of these cases, highlighted the kind of the issues in Italy's media landscape. There's kind of this like conflict of interest between media ownership and politics and business, and all this kind of intertwines and affects press freedom as well. Journalists were often arbitrarily blocked from attending court hearings, press conferences, and other events. There were several cases where news outlets had significant issues with prosecutors' offices. They failed to properly communicate with media, and journalists were often banned from covering like high-profile public interest trials, which was quite problematic. We also recorded 7 serious incidents of physical violence perpetrated by private individuals on journalists and other media employees while they were on assignment. We also documented 5 cases of death threats against journalists due to their work. And across the country, these so-called anti-vax groups vandalized editorial offices. So we are still, seeing the remnants of the COVID times in this regard. Public officials frequently verbally attacked journalists and media professionals critical of the government. And the government also introduced several controversial legal reforms, which could negatively affect press freedom. And there was also a rise in vexatious lawsuits, especially criminal and civil defamation lawsuits, aimed at silencing independent journalism. And these were particularly filed by politicians, political parties, and public authorities, which was very worrying. Some of the prominent legal cases against journalists and news outlets I could mention too. The Perugia Public Prosecutor's Office launched an investigation against 3 Domani journalists over alleged breach of secrets, following a complaint by Defense Minister Guido Crosetto. In another case, in July, police raided journalist Simone Innocenti's home and Corriere Fiorentino offices and seized their devices. Innocenti was investigated for allegedly revealing state secrets. So yeah, this is the kind of rough outline of all the different types of attacks that journalists and news outlets faced in Italy in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronya. And now we proceed to yet another candidate country, one that has been all over the headlines in the recent days. Ukraine has been suffering under Russian invasion for 3 years now. Karol, would you say the state of media freedom in Ukraine has deteriorated since the beginning of the war with regards to violations committed by the Ukrainian sources?
Hi, Gurkan. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, I'll respond to your question in just a bit. Just to start off, of course, my name is Karol. I'm the Eastern Europe Advocacy Lead at the International Press Institute, IPI, so we're a partner of the MFRR consortium. And at the MFRR, we are the ones responsible for monitoring and advocacy activities on Ukraine. So to answer your question, let me put it this way. The answer is complex because press freedom, there's different, if you're looking into press freedom violations by Ukrainian authorities, 2024 was definitely the worst year since the start of the full-scale invasion because we had very serious attacks on press freedom by Ukrainian authorities. These were linked to surveillance and intimidation of journalists, especially investigative journalists, in cases of outlets such as Slidstvo.info or Vyhus.info. There were cases of surveillance of these journalists by security forces. There were cases of intimidation of male journalists who were threatened to be drafted into the Ukrainian army if they didn't cease their publications. So yes, 2024 definitely was a very bad year for press freedom in Ukraine with regards to violations by Ukrainian authorities. Although 2025 was already showing that the issues have somewhat changed in the sense that Ukraine is right now in a very dire situation following the election of Donald Trump and the threat that American aid to Ukraine will be stopped overall. And because of that, paradoxically, the individuals among authorities who are responsible for targeting, intimidating journalists seem to have somewhat reoriented their priorities and are now busy with other more essential topics rather than trying to intimidate journalists. However, I think the question the question is very pertinent in terms of violations by Ukrainian authorities, but of course it needs to be reminded that these violations by Ukrainian authorities can't really be compared to the violations committed by Russia, by Russian sources, Russian military, and other Russian authorities with regards to journalists in Ukraine. Since the start of the war, the MFRR consortium has registered about a dozen journalists killed while reporting in Ukraine. About 50 more journalists were wounded while reporting, injured under Russian fire. There are approximately 30 Ukrainian journalists who are, as we speak, under arrest by Russian authorities, by Russian occupying authorities in eastern and southern Ukraine. This is in Crimea and in other regions of southern and eastern Ukraine. One of these journalists was killed last year. She died in Russian custody and in not clear circumstances. And I think it's important to just underline that while these violations by Ukrainian authorities certainly have taken place, and they were worse in 2024. This shouldn't obscure the general security situation, which has been provoked by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine over 3 years ago. And the last element to mention here would be the targeting of media offices and media infrastructure, because dozens of media offices and TV towers and other elements of infrastructure have been destroyed in Ukraine by Russian military forces since the start of this war. And I think that would actually maybe sum up most of what I wanted to say, so maybe I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karol. And then we proceed to yet another EU country now. France was a country where we have recorded a significant number of violations in the year 2024. And Camille, you were mentioning in the report that the cases of censorship has tripled in the year 2024 compared to 2023. Could you please tell us more about this worrying figure and the major developments in France from the past year?
Thank you, Görkem, for the introduction. And yes, unfortunately, not really good news regarding France with the situation really getting very worrying, especially when you look at those numbers with the serious cases of censorship. Among the instances, you had, of course, journalists, media outlets being refused to events, block access to some information, often by public officials, but also when it comes to demonstration with police officers, violence still concerning. But this year, in 2024, in France, was marked by the high-profile rape trial, the Mazon trial, in which the conditions of the journalists were particularly concerning and showing really this need to strengthen their protection, especially when it comes to such a high-profile trial. So Gisèle Pellicot, so you had 51 men on trial for having raped Mrs. Pellicot, judged by her husband. And among the instances, you had the photojournalist Frédéric Munch from the SIPA Press Agency. So he was striped accreditation from this trial, especially after documenting violence at the trial from the defendants. So after documenting, for example, sexual threats from the rapist at the trial, or obscene gestures and verbal abuse, and also an attempt of assault him by one of the defendants. And then he was struck accreditation. But you could see that was really, in this case, particularly concerning, especially given the nature of such a trial. And journalists are also facing pressure to hand over sources. We recorded 3 arbitrary detentions with attempt of the judicials to criminalize investigative journalism. As an example, you had this Blast journalist who was arbitrarily detained for 32 hours. And one event checked the countries was when the disclosed journalist, Ariane Lavrieux, was summoned by this magistrate specialized in the fight against terrorism. So she was summoned on the 17th January. But Ariane Lavrieux, we all know that she faced threats of prosecution for revealing the national defense secrets after reporting on France action in Egypt. So she had previously her home raid, she was taken in custody, following the complaint by the French Ministry of Defense for disclosure of national secret. And we all learned that she would be summoned. And it really shocked the countries. And even if the charges were finally dropped at the beginning of this year, there is really this emergency to strengthen the legislation to protect journalist sources and to avoid such surveillance and judicial harassment. Verbal abuse was one of the most frequent type of attacks. You could see the rise of online threats, especially ahead of the European and as well the legislative election. One case was particularly concerning was when we discovered an article published on the far-right website, Réseau Libre, on which you had 180 individuals, including journalists, a lot of journalists threatened with a shot in the back of the head for having called for protection of independent journalism. And among them, you had Nassira Al-Muadem, who works for Arrêt sur Image, who was targeted, but also in another article. And she also received a threatened letter at her home, racist letter. And in fact, France was really marked by racism and xenophobic attacks, especially in June during the election time, with the cases really exploding and with the journalists all the time threatened with racist remarks. Regarding assaults, there were few assaults compared than 2023, but still police violence at demonstrations were particularly concerning, especially after the elections or during the elections when protesting against the results.
Thank you so much, Camille. And this also opens up the topic of elections, which was yet another significant development throughout 2024, with over 80% of the global population heading to ballots. And in Europe alone, there were more than 50 elections of different levels that were taking place. Ronya, how did the super election look like in Europe in terms of media freedom?
Thank you, Görkem. Yes, you could really see that it was a super election year, also based on the data that we collected. Journalists covering elections faced various threats and different kinds of obstruction due to their work. Of course, the situation was especially alarming in Georgia. None of the other countries really even compared to that. But of course, we had also many worrying incidents also in many of the other countries that we monitor. Physical violence was reported on several occasions. And what was especially worrying was that over half of these cases, the perpetrators were police or state security. To give you a few examples, in eastern Turkey, after the local elections, there were several protests, and journalists covering these demonstrations were physically attacked by police and also detained. In another incident in Turkey, journalists from multiple different agencies were shot at while covering a dispute at a local ballot box. Fortunately, no one was injured, but it was a very serious incident. In Bulgaria, a BTV camera operator was physically attacked while covering a polling station as well. And in terms of obstruction and access to information, journalists were often obstructed or blocked from accessing polling stations and election events. Verbal threats, harassment was also very common at polling stations, election events, and also online. And several journalists covering election topics were also targeted by large-scale smear campaigns online. We also recorded 8 cases of death threats against journalists covering elections. In France, far-right supporters sent death threats to 3 journalists. In Turkey, journalists covering local elections received death threats as well. And in Bulgaria, journalists investigating voter fraud or alleged voter fraud were threatened. And in Romania, the supporters of the far-right presidential candidate threatened journalists and their families as well, which was very alarming. We also documented cases of editorial interference. For example, in Hungary, pro-government outlets circumvented election rules to promote Fidesz party candidates. In another case in Romania, local newspapers under Hungarian Media Works publishing house published unmarked campaign articles as part of this kind of political arrangements. And in Italy, concerns were raised due to legislative changes affecting media freedom and impartiality of public broadcasting during the European elections. We also saw different types of online issues online. So social media accounts and articles were blocked. And we also had cases of spoofing related to elections, and also a few DDoS attacks, which hindered reporting during elections. In terms of legal threats, I had a few examples. In Turkey, 2 journalists faced investigations over reporting on election irregularities. And in Hungary, news outlet Index was sued by a local municipality over an article about alleged election abuses and vote buying. So here is a rough overview of election-related cases that we documented last year. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ronya, and we will come back to you in a bit once again. In the year 2024, yet another significant type of media freedom violation was spoofing, which involves cases of impersonation, identity disguise, or falsification of data with intent to deceive and manipulate audiences. And Carol, we are once again coming back to you. What was the impact of cyber squatting and doppelganger disinformation campaign on the levels of public trust in media?
Hi again, Gürkan. Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm assuming your question is related, I'll mainly answer the question in terms of the situation in Ukraine, which is kind of my field of responsibility within MFRR. So the doppelganger campaign, just to give a bit of context, this was a campaign across Europe. I mean, in many countries of Europe, we found, I think, 5 or 6 in which this campaign was active, but there are likely more than that. This was a campaign which has been found to have been orchestrated by Russian sources, in which these Russian sources created fake news pages imitating that of legitimate news outlets. So the typical way to proceed was creating a copy of a legitimate news outlet. Let's say for instance, like Le Monde in France, or I forgot what the case we had in Germany. In Ukraine, this was an outlet called Ukrainska Pravda, also a local outlet called RBK. So these were well-known outlets for the publics, and these Russian sources would create web pages which had very similar domain names, which had maybe a few letters difference, which had a very similar site design, and these websites, articles from these websites would be promoted then on social media, most notably in the Ukrainian case on Facebook. And often the articles which were promoted were, at least in Ukraine, they had this dominating narrative of Ukraine is losing the war, Ukraine needs to surrender, Ukraine needs to negotiate with Russia. And obviously these were narratives which wouldn't have appeared as news articles. These articles wouldn't have appeared as news articles in these legitimate outlets in which they were originally from. But the visual design of these legitimate outlets was used to kind of put forward this kind of messaging. So this was kind of more or less the kind of the context in which this campaign was carried out.
Thank you so much, Carol, once again. And our final topic on the agenda today is yet another pressing issue across Europe: climate change and environmental reporting, which has become a hot topic in recent days with the developments taking place at the European Parliament level even. Ronja, could you tell us more about what kind of threats and obstacles journalists reporting on environmental issues have been facing?
Thank you, Gürkan. Yes, exactly. As we know, climate change and different types of natural disasters are causing widespread harm across Europe at the moment, and journalism, of course, plays a crucial role in addressing the climate crisis and raising public awareness about these issues. Unfortunately, journalists who report on these topics often face threats and obstruction. I think we could kind of separate like two main contexts of issues that we are talking about here. The first one is journalists who investigate and reveal climate and environment related cases are often targeted by politicians, companies, business owners who try to hide their environmentally harmful activities. And the other type is climate protests, or somehow like environment related protests, like the farmers protests across Europe. And journalists are unfortunately often targeted either intentionally or unintentionally while they cover these protests, either by police or by the demonstrators themselves. And to give you a few examples, of these protest-related violations, unfortunately, police were often involved, as perpetrators. As an example, in Spain, in the aftermath of the devastating Dana storm that claimed, many lives and caused massive destruction, Público journalist Fermín Grodeira was injured by police while covering a protest against the government action during the storm. And journalists were also detained and obstructed by police while covering climate and environment related protests in Italy, Germany, Belgium, and France. And journalists like Telecinco's Adam Salvia in Spain were physically attacked by protesters, unfortunately. And yeah, as I mentioned, journalists face attacks and harassment during the farmers' protests in Spain, Germany, and Albania. And another topic are definitely the natural disasters. We're talking about forest fires, floods, earthquakes, so on. And of course, like, journalists are already risking their safety by, being there on the ground reporting about these issues. But then they are sometimes also, obstructed by authorities or, even physically attacked, if they, are documenting some, illegal activities. Another hot topic in Europe is illegal waste dumping or waste trafficking, and also mining. And journalists covering these topics are also often attacked. For example, in Albania and Croatia, journalists were attacked while reporting on illegal waste dumping. And in Serbia, the Rio Tinto mining company has also targeted and discredited journalists critical of their operations. Another, types of legal threats that we have seen. Italian oil company Eni was very active, unfortunately, in this regard, threatening legal action and even taking legal action against news outlets and the people that they interviewed over their critical reporting about their operations. And in Spain, a waste incinerator company, did similar legal threats against a documentary film crew who were investigating their activities. And also, last thing, we saw many verbal attacks by politicians. As an example, in Georgia, the parliament speaker discredited a journalist who had been investigating a deadly natural disaster. And also in Slovakia and Albania, politicians verbally attacked journalists who were investigating environmental issues. Thank you. That was all from my part.
Thank you, Ronja, and thank you everyone for your remarks regarding the monitoring report and for all your hard work in the production of this report. There are a few questions that we have received in the chat. The first question is for Teona. How are the journalists fighting back, and how can international community help with the struggle on media freedom in Georgia?
Thank you, Gürkan. That's a really difficult question to answer, and I probably won't be able to answer it fully. But we call journalists and media the voices for the voiceless quite often, and I think that's in these cases when we see this really strong clampdown on media, they can be voices for themselves as well. I think what we have seen in Georgia, especially first time the foreign agent law was introduced, was that the power also lies within the journalists and the way they, kind of assert themselves. They have demonstrated really a very high level of solidarity. They have communicated with their audiences what was really happening. Why was this foreign agent law so harmful? Just as an example, when they were subjected to smear campaigns, they have always fought back. And yeah, it might look like sometimes that might be some sort of a frustration that this is not working, but honestly, on the other hand, the Georgian journalists are subjected to so many different threats and so many attacks that it's actually quite surprising that there is still independent journalism in Georgia, and that is because they have again fought back, and they have gone to the street. They have spoken up for themselves and stood up against the rising authoritarianism. As for the international community, first, what I would like to say is that yes, they will be fighting back. They will continue fighting back, although there are new pieces of more restrictive and repressive legislation proposed now, including the banning of the foreign funding altogether, including the exact translation of FARA. I cannot go into the details now, but it's really important that they feel the support and solidarity from the international community, whether it is the advocacy support or whether these are other kind of pressure that the international community can place on the ruling Georgian Dream Party, including sanctions. This is really crucial, and I think that for a very long time it was really difficult to believe how far Georgia has fallen. And for many people, from many people I've heard, oh, this happened overnight. This happened. Democratic backsliding just happened in a few months. That's not quite right, because this has been happening for a while. And I think it's really important that when there are first signs of democratic backsliding, there is also a really rapid response and rapid reaction from the international community. And the final thing I would say is that none of these examples that we are bringing, none of these countries are isolated examples, and authoritarianism, illiberalism is quite contagious, and it's really important to know that, to realize that the results of the democratic backsliding in Georgia or press freedom erosion in Georgia are also spilling over to other parts of Europe or even Central Asia or obviously the South Caucasus. And it's important for the international community to understand that. Threats to press freedom somewhere, even in small countries like Georgia, are threats to press freedom pretty much everywhere. Thanks.
Thank you, Teona. And then the next question, are there any common themes or patterns across all the countries studied in the report that signal emerging challenges to press freedom? Kara, would you like to take this question?
Yes, thank you. I think a lot of the general patterns have already been touched upon in the different contributions by the monitoring officers, because you really see them repeated in a lot of the monitoring countries. I can mention a couple, but I'm sure there are more, because we've just in general seen an increase in attacks, which also is sort of reflective of an, I would say, increasingly hostile environment for journalists and media workers. I think a significant point is online attacks. So if I'm not mistaken, last year, so in 2023, demonstrations were still one of the most dangerous workplaces for journalists. They still are, but we have seen an increase in online attacks, and specifically sort of AI-related and hacking, spoofing, deepfakes. So this sort of group of attacks has definitely increased last year. We've also seen a general increase of attacks by legislation, especially verbal attacks by politicians. This is also quite concerning because these are sort of attacks that are amplified by a lot of people who are looking up to these figures of authority, so they can have definitely huge repercussion for media workers and journalists affected. I would say this is a category. We've also seen an increase in blocked journalistic activity. This does include censorship, so sort of editorial interference, but also just general obstruction of journalists' work, be it at demonstrations or be it at sort of political events, venues, when journalists are being denied access. This is surely also tied to just in general the 2024 super election year, where there has just been politically a lot at stake throughout the entire monitoring region. This is definitely a pattern we've seen. And maybe a last point I would like to mention is just in general legal threats. This does include anti-media laws. This does include slaps. And we see more and more of those, which is quite concerning. But I'm sure there are also many more.
Thank you so much for your answer, Kara. I would like to ask our other panelists also if there is any further contribution you would like to make to this question. Camille?
Yes, thank you, Gurkan and Kara. I just want to add that it's really important to keep in mind that online threats can really escalate beyond the screen. We've monitored so much attacks starting from online and becoming offline, and also not to underestimate the impact of the online threats. It's not a confined parallel world. It can really affect the journalists and have a first impact on the access to information, as we've seen on spoofing, but also on the security of the journalist, because we unfortunately monitored threats escalating home and prompting us to react as fast as possible. So I would say it's really important for us to keep monitoring, but to be aware that we have this online threat emerging in everywhere. It's very contagious, and we need to be aware that it can be offline as well.
Thank you for your contribution, Camille. And the final question, are these attacks usually made on national newspapers or more on smaller local media outlets? And for this question, Ronja, perhaps?
Thank you, Gurkan. Yes, I think we, from the cases that we document and also cases that we receive from our local networks, I'd say, there are both, big national and international news outlets, and then also smaller, smaller investigative outlets or local news outlets. I think we have quite large variety of all of them, but this might be just more of a gut feeling that I have based on my experience. It could be that the cases that we come across in our monitoring, maybe the cases involving big national or international outlets are more visible, so they're easier for us to spot as well. So it might be that we are not catching all the threats that local media are facing, which we are continuously working on to improve this. Another thing that I would like to highlight related to this is that what we have to keep in mind when we are talking about these big outlets compared to smaller or local media outlets is the difference in resources that they have. So let's say, you're doing, investigative reporting, doing some big revelations, and you might face, let's say, legal retaliation due to a reporting. When you have more resources to fight back, you're more secure, your journalists are covered, legally, for example. And on the other hand, when you are a smaller outlet, you don't have as much money to fight back, in the courts. It brings a certain kind of, there are dangers to that, and definitely like the level of, threat that you are under in this case is definitely higher for the smaller and local outlets. And I think local outlets also, they face a little bit like different kinds of threats. So we are talking about local politicians, local businesses, and they might be like really tricky situations that you get yourself into, because as usually local outlets have to kind of try to balance between serving the local communities, but then also holding power to account. And it might be a very, very difficult situation. And also, what I touched upon, the resources, funding is also another crucial point here, because at least from my experience, like many smaller outlets, they rely on public funding, from like municipalities, for example. And of course, it's difficult, when you're trying to do investigative journalism on abuses of power in a local council activities, for example. And let's say then the local businesses or the public funding, they're threatening that they will withdraw this funding if you write critical pieces of them. So of course, this is another important point to consider. And then also many of these smaller outlets are funded by grants, sometimes foreign grants. We talked about the foreign agent laws, for example. And unfortunately, these investigative critical outlets, they are dependent on grants like this because they have been blocked from public or state funding, for example. And in captured media landscapes that we unfortunately see both in some EU member states and candidate countries, these smaller, investigative outlets, independent outlets, and local media, sometimes they might be the only ones kind of like doing this very important independent reporting. So we also have to keep that in mind. But yeah, a little bit longer answer to this question, but I think really, really important topics to think about when talking about these issues.
Thank you so much, Ronya. And with that question, we finalize our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We have discussed the state of media freedom in Europe with a special focus on Georgia, Italy, Ukraine, and France, as well as having a spotlight on the emerging topics such as elections, spoofing, and environment-related news coverage. This webinar has been produced as part of the Media Freedom Rapid Response, which tracks, monitors, and reacts to violations of press and media freedom in EU member states and candidate countries. The MFRR provides legal and practical support, public advocacy, and information to protect journalists and media workers. The MFRR is organized by an alliance led by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, including Article 19 Europe, the European Federation of Journalists, Free Press Unlimited, International Press Institute, and Observatoriu Balcanii Caucaso-Transeuropa. MFRR was commenced in 2020 and is co-funded by the European Commission. You may find the full report and all alerts mentioned by the MFRR on our monitoring database, Mapping Media Freedom. And please keep in mind that you may also inform us about the press and media freedom violations by visiting mappingmediafreedom.org and filling out the reported form linked on top right corner of the database. Thank you again for joining us.